From deep behind the enemy lines of FEMA Region 3, you're listening to the Powder Monkey Podcast on PirateInfoWars.com.
Episode 58 of the Powder Monkey Podcast. The episode today for the third time. They say the third time is a charm, and this one is, proven that saying true. Back with us again, sailing aboard the Powder Monkey to talk about his latest volume. Volume 8, Confessions of an Illuminati, From the Rise of the Antichrist to the Sound of the Devil and the Great Reset. I have patriot, author, producer, musician, a man of many hats, a man of many talents, Leo Zagami. Thank you for coming back aboard the Powder Monkey Podcast and spending some time with us this afternoon.
Always a pleasure, Patrick. Glad to see you still rocking it here with patience and, like you said before starting, a labor of love indeed when you are working with so much censorship. I see that you have moved around things with turning things around with Rumble, which is, of course, an option that we all have. So let's get on with this show, which I probably would love to also broadcast on my channel in the future, on YouTube myself, still as I am persisting, even after the strikes, the many strikes, the blocks and all that. I kind of insist, but it's like mostly now restricted to those people who really want to view me and listen to what I have to say and follow my books, because, of course, we don't have the large audience that we used to have when the channels were much more popular, and then of course we reach much higher numbers of subscribers. But I think that these days, as we are all forming micro communities in a way, even in the virtual world of the internet, we kind of following that kind of trend.
Right. So, that's the thing. I mean, Alex does the thing where he changes his URL to kind of mask and get out there, but and that's effective. But the thing about it, and you're right, it's kind of like Coca-Cola having to change their name every 6 months and start all over with that rebranding and top of mind awareness and everything that it takes to have a successful campaign to begin with. And then they cut the knees out from underneath people like you and like me.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think that still I have the best option by writing books. And especially I insist once again on people purchasing hard copies of my books, aside from maybe having the Kindles just for because they're handy and they can go to the cafe with it and just read it on the go, because this is, of course, a 700 pages book, so it's not an easy read on the road. But I would suggest that you always get the hard copy now, as the censorship in the future will immediately be unleashed, editing books in a way that probably the original author will have prevented. But this is how it works probably in the future of the books that are made available to the public.
I heard you mention the value of books, paper books. Especially ones that have been handed down at one point. And I think you're so right about that. That even just the smell can take you back to not just gain that knowledge, but take you back in time to to a, to when you were 4 and you were flipping through the books, just pulling them out at random, So yeah, and it's a link to your past, and it's something that they can't erase. I was going to ask you, because this is the first book I've actually done, especially when I'm reading to do research from a Kindle. From a research point, it's not very easy to do. You can't copy and paste as easy. You have to take your notes and everything. But I've heard authors in the past discuss, Kindle selectively removing things. Have you experienced that, or have you seen anything?
It's just direct censorship once with one of my first books that I self-published on the internet a few years back, which was basically removed because the lawyer of the Ordo Templi Orientis contacted Amazon, and to avoid any problem, I simply went back on the book, took away whatever they might have. I mean, it was just they were trying to attack the book by saying that I had used copyrighted material in symbols that they use within their order. But in any case, from my point of view, those symbols were never really their own creation, because we know that the OTO was founded even before Aleister Crowley. In any way, it's stuff which belongs to the mystery school tradition of the West in general, and should have no copyright. But that's something that happened. They just simply removed the book, and I then went on, and then myself, I published a few months after a different version of the same book, just trying to avoid those things that could be used by their lawyer to put it down. Aside from that, I've been lucky enough up until now to not have these kind of problems. But I know that is happening with various authors, probably more established than me, that probably have also the scrutiny not only of the AI, which is what usually Amazon does, or when they are about to publish a book, but probably they will have some people scrutinizing it personally, with the real people. So that is probably something they do, and they can do only for big authors, because if they start to do it with everybody, I think it will be impossible, no? Right. So at the moment, maybe I'm lucky enough to not be so big to attract all that attention that would bring me the censorship with the books. However, I must say that I had some problems in the past when I was in Italy, when I was actually publishing my books in Italy, and suddenly in 2013, the end of 2013, because of my political activity, they actually removed the books from the bookshops, and they censorship, they censored me in every way possible, aside from receding from the contracts I had. Which was, of course, then big damage for me economically, because at that point I was really very much making my living out of the Italian market, aside from the Japanese market, which has been the first place where I published my books. Then I came and published my books here in the US, and the only book I had problems with here in the US, which was censored, and is still censored actually in some penitentiaries. That's the strange thing, but it's true. They basically, volume 2 of my confessions was a book that I think had elements that the Satanists didn't like. In fact, the Brotherhood of Satan is a satanic sect which I had denounced. They went after my publisher, and my publisher decided to then omit several pages of the book from future editions and from the Kindle to avoid having any legal problems. Having said that, I didn't stop my exposure of the Brotherhood of Satan in subsequent books, which I published myself, because I didn't really care. I think that the problem here is that, of course, they were one guy in the Brotherhood of Satan in particular had said he wasn't a public person. When you go on his Facebook, he has basically a proper pic where he says appeared on Fox, CBS, more public person than that. So it was a kind of something that didn't make sense. But of course, that was one thing. And then later on, the state of Arizona Penitentiary Department contacted my publisher to let or somebody contacted my publisher to basically let know that my book was prohibited within the penitentiary system of Arizona.
Wow.
Now, I don't know how many other states have adopted this decision, but I know that actually I wasn't the only author that was unfortunately suffering this kind of censorship. But it was pretty shocking. I mean, why shouldn't a guy, an inmate of a jail, be able to read a book? I mean,
sure.
What's he gonna do? Is he he's in a jail, poor guy. I mean, you know. So it was a little bit shocking, yeah.
Right. You know, and speaking of that, one of the great things of doing these type of podcasts and doing the things with your volumes is that it's actually a time capsule. And when I was preparing for this episode, I went back and I listened to your first two. And the first time you were on, it was pre-pandemic, and so everything went well. We had a great discussion. The second time you came on,
which year was that?
I'm sorry.
Which year was that?
2019.
No. So I was already here in the U.S.
Yes. And then you came on for episode 33 after the pandemic. And so, and just to see the difference, and it's not just in this podcast, it's, if you go back and watch what has happened, psychologically, and we're going to get into that here in just a minute with how they do it with in certain frequencies and tones and everything else, but just the gambit that they ran, the whole thing that we now have seen come crashing down, the congressional hearings, the censorship, the selective censorship, things I was saying back in 2016 because I was hearing it, from people like Alex Jones and you and David Icke and all these other people who had been warning, but anyway, just to see it, we couldn't mention the V word. And it wasn't what would normally get you censored back in the 60s and 70s on a show. So, it's just to see it, where we are. I never thought I would wake up in a point in time where we were here. My grandma always warned me. She was a Christian, but she always told me the time was coming. But to see it actually take shape, and I think you mentioned that you've gone so far as to say we are in the last phases of the Antichrist's setup, and so we'll get into that now. Music, power is defined as the ability to have, to make someone or something do that which it would not normally would have done. So music fits that perfectly. You can hear a tone and be sad and automatically be uplifted. And we're going to talk about maybe why that's happening. So Leo, I'm going to let you, I'm going to let you go. There's good tones, there's bad tones. My son, who has just graduated from West Virginia University, he is like a musical wizard now. He was by yesterday, and I was preparing for the show, and I was like, "What do you think about 440 and 432?" And he said he flipped out. Just had on his phone. He had all these Fibonacci sequences and color tones, and he's just like he's a musical wizard, I guess. but get into it, Leo. Let's start. You wrote it, and I'm going to let you skipper us through here. You'll be the captain for this episode, and just break it down for everybody. What has gone on. You make a really good point about Hollywood. And how it got its stigma of Babylon. You talk about the egregore. So let's just get into it, man. The wheel's all yours, sir.
Thank you so much. Well, I hope that what I said before the pandemic was in line with what happened later after, but I think that you had over again the confirmation of what I was denouncing and exposing. In fact,
you had the WHO logo on your book before.
Actually,
so yeah, I think you called that one.
Going back to volume 2, that was the book where I predicted that 2020 as the year the virus will lock people up in their homes. So, I mean, that was pretty much a very accurate prediction, right to the point. Regarding the retuning of music at 432, which is the initial topic of my book, this happens because, of course, music is something that people regard way too often as entertainment, when in reality, in the ancient mystery schools, it was considered something much more serious, and it was part of the mysteries that were transmitted by people like Pythagoras. And of course, we are with somebody who has given us one of the bases for geometry also, and for also the Freemasons themselves have a lot of things that are connected to that old Pythagorean sect, mystery school, call it however you want, which considered geometry as solidified music. So the relationship between the harmonic sounds and the way they are produced, and the way that really after the Big Bang, how life started in this universe, how this universe started with something that was, of course, very noisy. We call it Big Bang, so it's like a big bang. It's sound in itself, And then, of course, when it comes down to music, these 7 notes, which in a way are connected to the 7 planets, these 7 notes, which are
7 spirits of God.
Yeah, but also the result of what Guido d'Arezzo, who died in almost 1,000 years ago, and who established this system of 7 notes, picked up from singing this poetry piece dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, which is itself another important figure in Freemasonry. We have Saint John the Baptist and Saint John the Evangelist, symbolizes also the winter equinox, the moment, as well as the summer solstice. So the musical scale, of course, was representing something sacred that can be, of course, abused, and then it becomes something completely not sacred, and it actually can drive you in the hellish department. Now they can drive you below rather than above. So what happened was that I started my book with a project in 2014, which I published in Italy 8 years ago. It was a much shorter book of 230 pages that I published in Italy, dedicated to this subject. And I started my research but it was natural for me, because I used to be a record producer, I used to be a DJ, I used to be somebody involved in the music business. So for me, it was simply like elaborating something connected with what I used to be my previous life. I had many lives, I had many things that I did in my life, and I was very successful as a record producer. I published something like over 40 singles, 5 albums, and I performed even at the Bolshoi in Moscow and around the world. So I was always, for me, music was a sacred thing. Now, I myself was involved in the Illuminati under various disguises, the Ordo Templi Orientis, Fraternità Sorority Cruciana Antigua, Fraternità Saturn, various secret societies I became involved in, and of course Freemasonry, and of course I knew the power of influencing people through frequencies, And 432 was Verdi's A, Verdi's Do. It was basically Giuseppe Verdi was this great musician in Italy we had that is very well known because he lies at the basis of our national anthem,
Sure.
Verdi's is definitely his operas, his work is definitely, but what happened is that in 1939, at the eve of the Second World War, people like Goebbels, as well as people in England who were working with the BBC, decided to have a summit, a kind of gathering. You might think that they were interested in something different on the eve of a world war that will,
Right.
that having to tune instruments on a different frequencies, because when you tune instruments, up until 100 years ago, it depended where you were around the world, what kind of instruments you were playing, and you would fine tune them depending on the local kind of tradition. Then there was this impulse 100 years ago to standardize things, and it happened initially with of course, the military bands. So within the US Army, we start seeing the first use of this fine tuning, no longer at 432, but rather at 430 hertz. And after the war, the International Standard Organization, which is a globalist body, of course, of the New World Order, they created the standardization. And why is it so important? Some people say that talking about 432 rather than 440 is just wasting your time, and that basically, anyway, if the music is good, and it plays good also at 440.
Right.
Maybe for the common ear, but not for a fine-tuned ear who is also searching not only for entertainment value, simply for disinterested listening of music, but for a much more deeper and maybe even an elevated moment in your own spirit. Like you said, music can change your spirit. And in that case, if you have the fine-tuned music, the right music at the right time, it can really lift you up. Like
what about
you to say, lift you up before you go. But I mean, yeah, definitely.
It can, but it also, one thing about music, just like books and video media, is that the subconscious doesn't have the ability to discern whether what the input it's getting is from something real or whether it's from something we're reading or watching or hearing. It just relates. That's why we relate to the underdog. That's why we really get drawn into these books, and we kind of become the character, or whatever perspective that book is written from. So subconsciously, it gets into our heads. It reverberates, deep within our psyche, I think. You mentioned my birthday in your book at the beginning, not specifically my birthday, but usually whenever I see my birthday, I like to point it out and talk about it for a minute. Jim Morrison, April 19th, 1971, you mentioned in your book. I was born April 19th, 1973. And I fancy myself that I have just, woken up the last few years and slipped under tyranny. But I realize now that it's been since the Second World War, at least. I mean, well before it, but since the Second World War that things have started to change. And you and I have really never known a time when it was before. Is that correct? I mean, we're under the propaganda MK Ultra, if you would, wing of it.
Well, of course, we were born in a different era. Now, when I said earlier, Giuseppe Verdi actually didn't compose the national anthem, Italian national, but he composed another hymn, which was the Hymn of the Nations. And he was like a guy who had maybe an idealistic vision of music, as well as the people who came after him and had that same idealistic vision of music that was lost, the moment in which music became more and more a propaganda tool. However, we have to admit that even in the times of Mozart, music was commissioned often by powerful people who, wanted this, wanted that. And so, the artists had to adapt. And at times, this came in conflict with their art, but most of them went along with most artists during the course of history. Leonardo da Vinci, rather than Michelangelo, had to compromise to a certain extent to have their art seeing the light and for surviving with their art, because it's often, more often that artists don't even manage to survive through their art. Most of them die destitute and don't have the great successes if they don't compromise. This compromise started to become more apparent, I think, after the Second World War, like you said, because a real and proper industry was born to manipulate the masses, and more consciously from the military-industrial complex, who, of course, in the Second World War was also involved with radio transmissions, with the late part of the war, then creating what was become the first television transmissions. And in the end, they went into the creation of record labels, because all these record labels, like I explain in my book, RCA, EMI, they are all born out of the military-industrial complex. And for that reason, then it's like the ugly side of entertainment that I really expose in this book. And when I wrote this book, the first time I went into the study of these topics, I came here in California, it was 2014, and I wanted to actually investigate them myself, if there was any truth in this kind of Hollywood Illuminati myth, which I then, thanks to the connections I had in Hollywood, the son of Oliver Stone, Sean, that later on will help me also with finding my first book deal, I was able to connect with various producers, people who make music and stuff, and then connect with the cinematic world and see if there was really this connection. And there was this connection, and it was actually worse than what I thought. So then I was capable of studying for many years this scene from a different point of view. Having met these people, some actors, friends of Oliver Stone, came and visited me in Rome. Now I'm not going to say who, because otherwise, but they prefer maybe some privacy regarding. But we went together to the Vatican, went together to various places, and met some Templar expert. Also, I remember one day I went with a limo. This famous actor brought me because he wanted to meet with this Templar expert in Italy, and all kinds of things. So I started to hear, though, things that I was, they said, we can't really tell you this publicly, but we want you to know this. And so they will go on and tell me this, and that. And so I take notes, I just go along. And then when I arrived here in 2019, and that's really my foreword of my book, Palm Springs, the fact that I moved here, and Palm Springs is directly connected to Hollywood. It was basically the playground for a long time of all the Hollywood stars, still is to a certain extent, because of this 2-hour rule that we have to respect. And then Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer owned large parts of Palm Springs. So it was the ideal place for me to learn, to continue my learning, and my investigative mission was definitely also accomplished once I got in contact with Roseanne Barr, who definitely addressed some of my questions regarding also the involvement of the Jewish people, and why there was these problems with some people in the Jewish world. And then of course, I started to understand there was this Erev Rav, then there was this Sabbathien Frankist, of course, involvement in Hollywood. And so in the end, it became very clear to me what Hollywood was and together with my previous experience in the music business, my own experience also in the show business, because my grandmother used to teach acting and used to work with Fellini, Zeffirelli, with two famous Italian film directors, legendary film directors. She herself was very famous as a PR of William Burroughs, who is a famous beat writer, as well as Brian Geisen. And so I started to put together all this material. And then a year ago, I remember I was more or less this time.
You mentioned it. You mentioned your Italian work on my show, and we talked about how you met the Pet Shop Boys, how your DJ experience. I think it was on my show where you mentioned, or maybe another interview I heard. But you mentioned that you were one of the first people to do the raves, and you actually created.
I brought Prodigy to do the first concert abroad.
Did you? What about? Talk just real quick, because there's a few things that I want to touch upon. But talk about your genre, because I have you have a funk, like a techno funk. Is that what it was?
You see, I started. Working in the music business very early. That was the early 80s, basically. I was a teenager. Sure. I had my first show, but I was also somebody who had the possibility, thanks to my grandmother, to meet all these famous people. So, suddenly I would be able to interact with a lot of famous people. From the music business, I will have a pass to go to EMI headquarters and then go to all their concerts, and basically wherever I would go would be treated like a VIP, and I wasn't really anybody. So
I gotcha.
It was pretty weird, because I was starting to basically interview people. But I was nobody, but thanks to the connections I had, I was able to reach them. But then I kind of put my own talent together musically, because I guess that from a very early age, my father had a friend called Tony Walmsley. He was a bass player. He actually played live with people like The Doors, like Jim Morrison, for example. He was a bass player. He was somebody who also composed a lot of songs and stuff. And he then retired from the music world about 40 years ago. He became a Tai Chi master, so he kind of left the music world to do something completely different.
Nothing wrong with that.
But when I was young, he would bring me all these tapes from all the various radios in America. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have the possibility of listening, to things, just pressing a button and you go anywhere in the world and listen to a radio. These days, it's very easy. At that time, you needed a tape. So he would bring me tapes from Philly 99 FM in Philadelphia, from WBLS in New York, from radio stations around America, that would give me an idea of the music, And there was, of course, this crossover at that time. It was very good, because the music genres were not so defined, and there wasn't any racism. Racism is something that unfortunately is born out of the leftist woke
completely
mentality.
Invented, yeah.
And so you used to mix, you could have Owner of a Lonely Heart of Yes played before a track by, the SOS Band, or another track by another group on the same radio, and you would be like, wow, and the mix was great. And so I got very much into producing my own radio show at a very early age. In December 1983, I started my first radio show. Having said that, I actually had been in the radio business from a very early age, because my mother also had her own show on Catholic radio. She used to bring me along. And when I was 10 years old, I started to read fairy tales for kids at a very early age, acting in small parts and this. And then I spoke. I remember after I started to receive these tapes from America. I was really an early guy. I started very early. When I was 10 years old, for my school exam, elementary school exam, which you do after the 5th grade in Italy when you're 10, I asked my mother to purchase a tape-to-tape, one of those that you go around with.
Reel-to-reel?
So I could then use this tape to mix parts of music and insert other. It was a very, of course, I mean, you are putting pause and then you start, but because it was so not so easy to integrate them, then I had the idea, okay, I'm going to buy some special effects. So from one track to the other, I will insert a special effect. And all this was done before I even started my radio show. So when I started really my first radio show, I had finally 2 decks. I had a mixer. I went through a lot to arrive there because I had to actually serve Mass for 3 years in a Catholic church to get to that position with the radio show, with the Catholic radio.
You mentioned that. You mentioned that last time. Now the guy who gave you the start, I mean, he's well known. I mean,
he established the SAT 2000, which is the Episcopal Conference official channel of the Vatican today. So I mean, it is a very known mediatic priest, Monsignor Mario Pieracci. So for me, it was like I guess that my faith was sealed by the fact that I came from a background of show business, of course, where my grandmother, but also my mother to a certain extent was involved. And then I had my father. My father used to have a TV show. I used to conduct a TV show on the occult at midnight in 1980.
Wow.
In a TV in Rome called Tele Roma 56.
Wow.
And together with a guy called Pietro Cimatti. Pietro Cimatti was a known author, and he was also part of a group. It was like an occult group called, I think, Gruppo 70. They used to do mediumship sessions and things, all kinds of weird stuff. But in any case, his show was on the paranormal and on the occult. And he went on for about, a couple of years with various shows until he decided that it was too much attention towards him. He didn't like what was happening around him. Things started to manifest, and he didn't like it. As a psychiatrist, he of course had been involved in the Sorbonne University with the MK Ultra studies on LSD. He had been himself also an academic, and he had left that academic work to perceive the more occult side of things, the paranormal that wasn't studied within the academic realm at the middle of the 70s. He left his work as a psychiatrist to deal more with that. And in the end, though, he decided, of course, that he preferred writing books because it was something that didn't demand a direct contact with the crowd that could interfere with his own life. And he made incredible. I mean, I remember one show he had guest Dario Argento, the film director who made so many horror movies. You know, Dario Argento made Suspiria. Now it's very popular. Even made a remake of Suspiria, Profondo Rosso, many other movies, and so it was interesting that I was connected to that world. I was born within a world in which people were discussing the occult, paranormal, psychiatry, things from a very early age. And my grandmother arrived one day, I must have been around 12, 11, I don't know, but I was very young. And she gave this Aleister Crowley book, the Book of Thoth, I remember, to my father. My father said, I'm not interested. And I said, I'm interested. So, I ended up starting to study, of course, the occult, because my family library was fueled with the occult. Sure. And at the same time, I would be listening to music. That was my pastime, listening to music and reading what I could read, which I wasn't allowed to read, by the way, because my father would have never allowed me to read those books. But I just went in when he wasn't around. He was a night person, so he used to kind of sleep until quite late, and so
4 or 5.
no, we will wake up around 1. But I had the morning time. I could go into the library, and maybe, and so with the excuse that I wanted to listen to music in my headphones, and he had a very good hi-fi system. Sure. I wanted to just and so that's what I did. Of course. When I was also 10 years old, my passion, like I said, was music, but also my passion was the occult, because I saw in the back of a comic this publicity for a book, which I then described this in Invisible Master, which is one of my books. I describe exactly which book it is, and it was a beacon book. So, and so I had the possibility to, in a way, be born around this link between the entertainment and the occult. And when I put together Volume 8, I was lucky enough to know a lot of the characters which I'm talking about, either through my grandmother, either directly, either through my work as a DJ, and either through the work I did also as a radio presenter, the work that I conducted for many years in countries like, for example, Russia, which was a country I worked for many years in the entertainment world in Russia. I was one of the first DJs there who really, you ask me what kind of music. You see, I was basically discovered as a record producer by the creator of house music, Marshall Jefferson, who was from Chicago, who is like considered like the godfather of house music.
I know you mentioned Jimmy Jam or Terry Lewis. Was it Jimmy Jam or Terry Lewis? You mentioned him as a one time as a as an influence.
I mean, these are people that definitely I look up to, and they were great producers. Even Quincy Jones is a great producer, which I mean, had a lot. I still think he's one of the greatest producers. I mean, and I had the opportunity of first starting in a recording studio with a duo. I was part in 1987. I became part of a duo that was with a rapper, of course, you know, but it was a white rapper, so it was a different kind, and it was one of the first white rappers again. But I did my first record with a guy called Gazebo, who was an Italo-American living in Rome. His father, I think, worked for the embassy, American embassy or something. And with him, we produced the first record. After that, I went on tour. But at the same time, I was also going to London often, staying with my grandmother, meeting all these various people, continuing with meeting people that I will interview. And at that moment, I started to become myself famous. And then at the time I was 19, 20, then suddenly the rave phenomena exploded.
You charted.
I was the guy who did the first rave in Italy in 1989. And this, of course, is confirmed by the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. It's not me who says it, because otherwise...
Right.
No, I have it written by actually a libtard leftist.
Fact check it, lefty.
And actually, at the same time, when they started to write about me, there was a journalist called Dino D'Arcangelo who started to follow me around because he saw this phenomena developing, and he was a music journalist. I say he was because unfortunately he died at the end of the 90s of tumor. And he died, of course, before his time. Nobody should die of cancer, but he was a very good friend of mine. And I didn't really care, and he didn't care about my political inclinations, were completely opposite to his, because he was a guy who was really understanding the bigger picture. And he wanted me to become a journalist. So he invited me to go to the headquarters of La Repubblica, which is the one with the Corriere della Sera, is one of the main two newspapers, to learn to actually be a journalist.
Right. You mentioned, I think at a point, there was this point where you were kind of tying in the music and the occult and everything. And that, I think...
this happened, you see, what happened was I went through various... I launched the rave scene in Italy. Then, unfortunately, I had inaugurated this after hours in this church that was consecrated, but the Vatican didn't take it very lightly that I was using a church to do this kind of thing. Sure. So in the end, I had to leave Italy in 1994, and I moved to England. In England, I founded my own record label. I had to start once again because, I was big, yes, but in Italy, I used to work in Switzerland, but I never worked in England. England is the #1 place in London where if you want to make it with music, but it's also a very harsh place. Nobody's going to,
Sure.
Who are you? And then nobody's going to care. But the thing is that in 1990, in Italy, I had actually made some groundbreaking record that was inspired by what was happening in Detroit, in Chicago, but with a different touch. And that record was the True Underground Sound of Rome, was the group we formed, and we published a couple of groundbreaking records who became, in turn, very popular here in America, in Chicago and in Detroit. So then I will have these people coming to me and say, wow, you're Leo Young. That was my artistic name, which is, by the way, also the surname of one of the surnames of my mother. So it's also actually a surname. It's not just Young. And Young, because it's also an aristocratic family of great importance. My ancestor Young was the tutor of King James, who wrote the King James Bible, just so you know. I mean,
wow.
So he was the tutor of King James. I went on to establish my record label after, of course, a couple of years in which I launched myself. And I wanted to still live the life, though, while I was launching myself. So I also created an agency where I was promoting record labels in Italy from England. So, and also promoting artists. So I became like a booking agency for a lot of big artists. And one of these big artists was the inventor of house music, Marshall Jefferson, who one day came to my house and listened to a track that I had made up in Blackpool, actually with a guy. And this guy used to be also a famous guy because he now lives in Los Angeles, called Mark Bell, and he basically was the singer of a song, of a new version of Don't Look Any Further, for a group called M People, Manchester. And his friends were people like New Order. They all used to hang out in this club called the Hacienda Club, which was one of the first clubs that played house music in Europe. And with him, we made this track, but nothing really came out of it. I just came back from Blackpool with this.
Are they associated with KLF as well?
KLF, I talked very much about them in this book, Volume 8, because KLF was...
Ancients of Moon. Yeah.
And it was actually the first track I played when I played at my first rave. It was the first track I just dropped. It was KLF, What Time Is Love. You know, and that was, for people who don't know, KLF are connected to Discordianists, but they're also connected to that movement, which was all created by a guy called Genesis P-Orridge, the Psychic Youth and all that movement around it. Now, I was lucky enough because Genesis P-Orridge was also a friend of my grandmother and actually worked with my grandmother in the early 80s for this tour that William Burroughs, Brian Geisen, and various groups like Cabaret Voltaire, which famous groups back then, were making with William Burroughs, you know, like, I mean, for people who don't know, William Burroughs is the author of Naked Lunch, but he's also the author of a book called The Wild Boys. And that Wild Boys had been extremely influential in the 80s.
Boy George.
Duran Duran, Wild Boys. I mean, I went out to dinner with the dancers of Wild Boys. I actually met also. I remember I went to the studio where Duran Duran was recording. I remember once with this guy John Adams, who was produced by I think Andy Taylor, and then I was very much into creating my own style of music, but at the same time, I was very much on the cutting edge of electronic music. From the very early stage of my DJing, from the middle of the 80s, one of the main tracks that kind of addressed this mix of things was Polar Castle 19. I don't know if you remember that track. Polar Castle 19 was a #1 hit also here in the US on Billboard and stuff. It was basically the first, it sampled parts of the war in Vietnam, 19.
Actually, there's, you know what? I do remember that. My dad is a Vietnam veteran, and that was, Paul Hardcastle. You know that YouTube, that was in my Powder Monkey playlist. We mentioned we discussed YouTube. YouTube will not allow me to play that because it is violent. It's too violent. They look it up. It's unless they've removed it already. But yeah, I love that.
I'm actually Paul amongst my friends on Facebook.
Wow. Well, yeah. Well,
so actually, I never met in person, if not once, by coincidence, and it wasn't actually a nice encounter. It was me going out of the Stevie Wonder concert and him with his Jaguar almost putting me down, and I was like, "Oh!" And then there was this guy, and but actually, he in 1985. He teach something, I think, different, because it was the time in which, of course, there was all this Africa Bambata, Zulu Nation, electro was becoming popular. At the same time, we had high energy. But he mixed with his samples something that was actually, he was denouncing something social with this track, that people were dying at age 19 in a war like Vietnam, in a hideous war like the war in Vietnam, and it was so for me a revelation almost of how you can address an important social issue through music.
Right.
And from that moment onwards, I started to always be inclined in following that kind of approach in my vision, also musically speaking. So even when I did my first EP of great success, which is True Underground Sound of Rome, but all the tracks will have specific titles. Like the opening title was, which became very successful, was The Secret Doctrine, and it was based on Madame Blavatsky. So, I mean, that was what I was doing when I was only 20. So you can imagine what I was doing 10 years later when I recorded The Magical Child, which instead was the album, which was played also by people like John Peel, and at the BBC was a big success in Russia. It sold 10,000 copies only in Russia. It was a big album in Russia, and a single, A True American Hero, with William Burroughs and the cover, which sampled pieces of also the Second World War, pieces of Austin, $6 million man, a true American hero. But I was trying a broken shell of a man depicting on the cover as a true American hero, William Burroughs, which is the most antithetic hero you can have, because William Burroughs is not really, it was a junkie, in a way, but he was also a genius, So I think that this book, probably amongst all the books which I have written, is probably the one that deals more than others. Actually, probably the only one that deals with all this information with my career in the entertainment world. Which also went through a time in which I was kind of 1985 and 1986, I was like, my grandmother was pushing me to do acting and to become an actor. But at the same time, I was starting to show signs that I could have actually made it with the music business.
You were adept
on my own, without any help. Yes, at the beginning, she helped me because when I was 16, 17, at one point when I was 17, she said, well, darling, if you want, very British accent, my grandma was very proper, we should, if you want, I can try to find a job for you in a club. And she actually found me a job in this club called Legends, which was in Bond Street, right in the center of London, with all the most exclusive crowd. The Rolling Stones came there, Mick Jagger, Style Council. People were like, all the VIPs were coming there, and suddenly I was DJing for them. So,
do you have moves like Jagger, Leo? Do you have moves like Jagger?
Definitely, I guess I have. Them these days. But in any case, it was definitely an incredible experience, because I was actually 17.
Amazing, yeah.
And I wasn't even technically allowed to be in a club where you sell alcohol.
Right.
Okay, but I was actually DJing, and at one point, it was Genesis P. one day that came to my house, and he used to have this thing of dressing up like a woman. And my grandmother didn't mind him going to the bathroom, transforming himself as a woman and having a cup of tea with us at 5. And one day he came up with a bunch of records, and he says, Leo, this just fall off a ban. I said, what full of? I didn't understand the concept. I don't know where he got these records. It was this many records, and they were all electronic house music with tracks that were not really available anywhere. I don't know where he got them, but then I picked up that music, and the night I started to play it in London. Now, in London, at that time, didn't play that kind of music. One of my friends, which now I have also on Facebook, he lives now in Los Angeles. He used to be a very popular DJ in the 80s, Jay Strongman. And he was actually an inspiration to me because he was the first English DJ to ever go to work in Russia when it was still the Soviet Union. And he was playing, basically in London, they were playing funk, things like James Brown, things like very much in the funk kind of thing. No? Sure. They were not into electronic. The people who were playing this kind of music were in Manchester. It was the Hacienda Club, which I told you about before. But there was nobody in London. So I started to play these tracks, and the people reacted positively in London to this music. But then I had to go back to Italy because I had to go back to school. And then, because I wasn't doing so well in school and my father wasn't very happy, he just sent me to the military in 1989. But before I went on to the military, I said, I want to do one last thing, and that is a rave. So that was, my first rave was born out of basically 1 month before the military. I put together, I had been working as a professional DJ, earning a lot of money working in Arezzo, with which was the home of Licio Gelli, with actually his side, with the guy who used to be his deputy, which was Pier Gentili, which his son is still my friend. Right. And they had this mega 5,000 people club. And I, at one point, said to my father, to my mother, listen, you can do whatever you want, but I'm earning $5,000 a month. Can you beat that? So I'm like, 1988, you know, and $5,000 a month was a lot of money.
That's a lot of money in 88.
Can you beat that? No. So I said, I'm going to study at my own pace. Plus, I went to my father and I told him, I made him actually a very serious, because my father was a very intellectual guy. So I couldn't just go there and say, I want to be a DJ, because he would have probably, he was already wanting to kick my ass all the time. So I went to him and I did a very sincere speech to him based on Kafka, which is a very important writer, and based on the fact that I didn't want to be brainwashed by these leftists in their schools.
Sure.
And I did. I remember still, I went up to the studio of my father and I said, okay, this is why I'm leaving this school. And I'm not going to be in this school any longer because I don't agree with them. And in fact, I was completely right, because the guy who actually was the head of the school, he used to work with the radio, with Don Mario Pieracci. He was actually called Don Paolo Pecoraro. Now, if you go on Wikipedia and you find this guy, he was the creator of what is known as Catto communism.
Okay.
A mixed elements of communism and Catholicism, and basically created an alliance which initially then became part of the leftist side of the Christian Democrat Party that ruled Italy for 50 years.
Wow.
And so he knew who I was. He knew my grandfather had been a politician, a very important politician. He knew who my father was. And he was giving me always a hard time, though I must say he was respectful of me until at one point he left the school because of old age, and a successor came into the school who didn't have the same kind of approach, because he didn't know who I was. He didn't have that personal link with me. And suddenly we got in a clash immediately. And so he started to write notes to my parents saying, I didn't do this, I was a bad student. I told him just to sorry. I said,
it's all good.
And I discovered that this guy was an ex-priest. He had been defrocked. Now, for me, a defrocked priest is the worst kind of priest, because it means that you have really lost everything, any decency, if you are a defrocked priest. And defrocked priests often are the worst. So I basically that experience brought me to leave the school at that moment. And then I will pick up my studies later on, because I went into the world of the music business, which is something that I was very successful, and created the first rave. Then I went also in the military, though, so I also had that experience. But in this book, I pick up from all these experiences that I think have been very important in my life, and I explain how this manipulation goes on behind the scenes. You know, when you go around the world and DJ, and at the same time in every single town, I remember I used to visit the lodge members of the Otto Tempi Orientis or Freemasons and stuff, and have direct contacts. It's a very different, you had the club, you had the music I was playing, which was very particular. And at one point, I decided to unify these experiences, and I created Electronic Voodoo, which was a one night, which I used to do in Iceland, in Belgium, in Russia, all over Europe, which was based on the concept of bringing out the esoteric side of music. And I would mix voices, frequencies and stuff, and it was a good experience. So I think I answered you very well with this, and I actually probably gave also a complete explanation of what my book is all about. It's about not only denouncing all this, but also about a personal experience, because when I eventually in 2003 went against these people, that was the end of my...
That was it. They came after you. They came after you at that point. It made it
impossible for me to DJ. I resisted basically 2 years within the music business from 2003 to 2005. And then I thought, I'm going to enough of this. And that's why in 2006, then eventually came out and exposed all this.
Absolutely. Leo, I promised I'd keep you at an hour. I do appreciate it. There were some things we didn't touch upon.
What we can do is maybe in a month, we can
absolutely
again, and we can have a second part, so you can.
Would love to do that. But how do they find your book? I recommend everybody. I would love to set up a second one here in a few, in a few weeks, a month, or whatever. How do they find your book in the meantime? How do they do that? And how do they support your work?
All the links to my latest books on leozagami.com with all my latest articles, and then of course you can find me on Amazon for all the previous books. So I would suggest always to go on leozagami.com, because it's also a way to see what's happening, behind the scenes. I tend to bring out these articles.
You do.
And
you do.
And then, the latest one, actually, I touched on Hollywood, what happened with the Oscars in China, which is one of the subjects, by the way, of this book. So
yes. I think you lay it all out.
Manipulations behind the entertainment business are all described in this book, as well as much more. So maybe we can go in the next episode we do together in the parts we didn't touch.
Absolutely. I will reach out to you and we'll set something up. Just as a teaser for part 2, then what I'm going to do is let you know, you mentioned the AI, you mentioned Cyber Satan. I don't know if you've ever been interviewed by an AI, but I asked an AI, if you could ask Leo Zagami, based upon his work, one question, what would you ask him? And so we will set that up for part 2, and we'll dive a little deeper into that in a few weeks.
That just before I leave you, is that ChatGPT is defamatory towards me, the one in Italy at least. In fact, there was several defamatory statements which I reported to the relative parties. They said that in 2017, the Wiesenthal Center had addressed me as a dangerous anti-Semite. Then I contacted myself, the Wiesenthal Center, to ask them if that was true, and they said it wasn't. So ChatGPT is built on lies.
Yeah, ChatGPT, this here in America, for some reason, and just briefly, it seems to be familiar with you. It's not so much negative. It refers to you as refers to your expertise and everything, but it doesn't. It only knows so much about you. I had to correct it. I would ask it to summarize certain things that I knew about you just to check it.
Defamatory, at least.
No, but yeah, we'll get a little further into that here in a few weeks.
The one in Italy was highly defamatory. Okay, you can say I'm against the church. I'm against that. That is quite clear. That I'm
yeah,
not.
No, it didn't do that.
That they said the Wiesenthal Center, and even they said that the Jewish community in Rome. I mean, I'm part of Jewish myself. It didn't make sense. It was completely defamatory. So there must be definitely different information which is fed in Italy rather than the one that is fed over here. So I'm glad that you are doing this, and I'm very much interested in following up with this interview with you and ChatGPT.
We will do that, sir. Thanks so much. Thank you for your time, Leo Zagami. Once again, it was a great chat. We'll do this here again in a few weeks. Thanks so much, man.
Ciao, Vadek.
Shrines on our head, phenobarbital makes us dead. To heaven's gate we will go, to climb aboard
for God, for country, for truth, for justice, for the Republic. You're listening to the Powder Monkey Podcast on PirateInfoWars.com.
The comet's coming, it's getting near. Our conscience numbing, we have no fear. I called my friends up and they're all here. We're putting in vodka, yeah.
Was that you?